In the small frontier town of Cedar Ridge, Wyoming, 1885, young Sarah McKenna faces public humiliation when she's falsely accused of theft by the town's most powerful merchant. As the townspeople prepare to parade her through the streets as punishment, a mysterious cowboy named Thomas "Tom" Brennan rides into town. Without knowing her story, he sees the injustice unfolding and makes a bold decision that will change both their lives forever. This is a story of courage, redemption, and finding love in the most unlikely circumstances. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Cedar Ridge, Wyoming, as Sarah McKenna hurried toward Morrison's general store with her small cloth purse clutched tightly in her hand. The year was 1885, and the frontier town was slowly finding its footing between the wild lawlessness of the past and the civilized future that seemed to creep westward with each passing month. Sarah's worn brown boots clicked against the wooden planks of the sidewalk as she navigated around the early morning shoppers. At 22, she possessed a quiet strength that had carried her through the hardships of frontier life since her parents' death 3 years prior. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her simple blue calico dress, though faded from countless washings, was clean and mended with care. "Morning, Sarah," called out Mrs. Patterson from her boarding house porch. "You're up early today." "Good morning, Mrs. Patterson," Sarah replied with a gentle smile. "Just heading to Morrison's for some supplies." The general store stood at the corner of Main and Cedar Streets, its painted sign weathered but still readable. Sarah pushed through the heavy wooden door, causing the brass bell above to announce her arrival with a cheerful chime. The familiar scents of coffee, leather, and various dry goods filled her nostrils. Behind the counter stood Ezra Morrison, a portly man in his 50s, with thinning gray hair and small calculating eyes. He was known throughout Cedar Ridge as a shrewd businessman who had amassed considerable wealth and influence since arriving in town 5 years earlier. His store was the largest and most well-stocked in the area, making him indispensable to the community despite his often unpleasant demeanor. "Miss McKenna," Morrison said with a curt nod, his voice carrying its usual tone of barely concealed disdain. "What brings you in so early?" Sarah approached the counter, her posture straight despite the slight tremor in her voice. "I need some flour, sugar, and coffee beans, Mr. Morrison, and perhaps some fabric if you have any blue cotton." Morrison's eyes narrowed as he studied her face. "Cash or credit?" "Cash, sir," Sarah replied, opening her purse to reveal several coins she had saved from her work as a seamstress for the town's wealthier families. As Morrison gathered her items, Sarah noticed his wife, Constance, emerge from the back room. Mrs. Morrison was a thin woman with sharp features and an even sharper tongue, known for her gossip and judgment of others. She wore a burgundy dress with intricate beadwork that spoke of expensive taste and imported materials. "Oh, Sarah dear," Mrs. Morrison said with false sweetness, "I heard you've been struggling to make ends meet since your parents passed. Such a shame for a young woman to be all alone in this world." Sarah's cheeks flushed slightly, but she maintained her composure. "I'm managing just fine, thank you, Mrs. Morrison." "Of course you are, dear," the older woman replied, her tone suggesting otherwise. "Though I do wonder how you afford such luxuries as new fabric when others in town are barely scraping by." The comment stung, but Sarah refused to rise to the bait. She had learned long ago that responding to such provocations only made matters worse. Instead, she focused on Morrison as he wrapped her purchases in brown paper. "That'll be $4.50, Morrison announced, his voice sharp. Sarah counted out the exact amount from her purse, her movements careful and deliberate. As she placed the coins on the counter, Morrison's hand swept across them, and in that moment his expression changed dramatically. "Wait just a minute," he said loudly, his voice carrying across the store. "Where's the rest of it?" Sarah looked up, confused. "I beg your pardon?" "The money," Morrison said, his voice rising. "I counted $5 in silver coins when you opened that purse. You've only given me $4.50. "No, sir," Sarah replied, her heart beginning to race. "I had exactly $4.50. I counted it twice before coming here." Morrison's face was growing red with apparent indignation. "Are you calling me a liar, Miss McKenna?" "I'm not calling you anything, Mr. Morrison. I'm simply telling you that I gave you all the money I had." Mrs. Morrison stepped forward, her eyes glittering with malicious interest. "Ezra, are you saying this girl has taken money from you?" "That's exactly what I'm saying," Morrison declared, his voice now loud enough to attract the attention of other customers in the store. "I saw $5 silver in that purse, and she's trying to walk out of here having paid only $4.50. That's theft, plain and simple." Sarah felt the world spinning around her. "That's not true. I would never search her, Mrs. Morrison demanded shrilly. Check her purse and her pockets. If she's stolen from us, we need to find the evidence. Before Sarah could protest, Morrison had come around the counter and was demanding she empty her purse completely. With trembling hands, she complied, turning the small cloth bag inside out to show it was empty, except for a few pennies and a worn handkerchief. Check her pockets, Mrs. Morrison insisted. I will not, Sarah said firmly, taking a step back. This is humiliating and unnecessary. I have done nothing wrong. By now, a small crowd had gathered in the store. Sarah recognized several faces: Tom Wheeler, the blacksmith, Mary Sullivan, who ran the town's only restaurant, and James Crawford, one of the local ranchers. Their expressions ranged from curiosity to suspicion, and Sarah felt her heart sinking as she realized how the situation must appear to them. If you have nothing to hide, Morrison said with false reasonableness, then you won't mind proving your innocence. Sarah's mind raced. She knew that submitting to such a search would be deeply humiliating, but refusing would only make her appear more guilty in the eyes of the growing crowd. Either way, she was trapped. I cannot, she whispered, her voice barely audible. There, Mrs. Morrison exclaimed triumphantly. She refuses because she knows we'll find the stolen money. Morrison nodded gravely. I'm sorry, Miss McKenna, but I'm going to have to ask Sheriff Bennett to handle this matter. No, please, Sarah said, her voice stronger now despite her fear. I haven't stolen anything. I don't even have another 50 cents to my name. How could I have taken money I don't possess? That's what thieves say, remarked Crawford, his weathered face showing disapproval. They always claim innocence. Sheriff Bennett arrived within minutes, his heavy boots announcing his presence before he even entered the store. He was a tall, lean man with graying hair and a mustache, known for his fair but strict enforcement of the law. Sarah had always respected him, and she felt a small flutter of hope that he would see through Morrison's accusations. What's the problem here, Ezra? Bennett asked, his voice calm but authoritative. Morrison quickly explained his version of events, painting Sarah as a desperate thief who had attempted to steal from his store. Mrs. Morrison added her own embellishments, suggesting that Sarah had been acting suspiciously for weeks. Miss McKenna, Sheriff Bennett said, turning to Sarah with a measured gaze, what do you have to say about these accusations? Sarah straightened her shoulders and met his eyes directly. Sheriff Bennett, I came here with exactly $4.50 to purchase supplies. I gave Mr. Morrison the precise amount he asked for. I have not stolen anything. Then you won't mind if we search you? The sheriff asked. Sarah felt tears threatening to spill over, but she forced them back. If it will clear my name, then I suppose I have no choice. Mrs. Morrison stepped forward eagerly. I'll conduct the search, Sheriff. We can use the back room for propriety's sake. As they moved toward the back of the store, Sarah caught sight of more townspeople gathering outside, their faces pressed against the windows. Word was spreading quickly through Cedar Ridge, and she realized that regardless of the search's outcome, her reputation would be forever tarnished. The back room was small and cluttered with boxes and supplies. Mrs. Morrison's search was thorough and humiliating, but ultimately fruitless. No additional money was found on Sarah's person or in her belongings. Well, Sheriff Bennett asked as they returned to the main store. Nothing, Mrs. Morrison admitted reluctantly. But that doesn't mean she didn't hide it somewhere before we caught her. Sarah felt a spark of anger finally breaking through her fear and humiliation. This is ridiculous. I've been accused, searched, and humiliated, and still you're not satisfied. What more do you want from me? Morrison's eyes gleamed with something that looked suspiciously like satisfaction. I want justice, Miss McKenna. Just because you hid the money well doesn't mean you didn't steal it. But there's no evidence, Sarah protested, turning to Sheriff Bennett. Surely you can't arrest me without any proof. The sheriff looked uncomfortable. Well, Miss McKenna, while it's true we didn't find the money on you, Mr. Morrison is a respected member of this community. His word carries considerable weight. More weight than mine, you mean? Sarah said bitterly. Now, I didn't say that, Bennett replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. But given the circumstances and the fact that you've been struggling financially, I think it's best if we find a way to resolve this matter that satisfies everyone. Sarah stared at him in disbelief. What are you suggesting? Morrison cleared his throat. In the interest of community harmony, I'm willing to forego pressing formal charges. However, I think Miss McKenna needs to understand the seriousness of her actions. Perhaps a public acknowledgement of her wrongdoing would be appropriate. I will not confess to something I didn't do, Sarah said firmly. Mrs. Morrison sniffed disdainfully. Such prideful stubbornness. This is exactly the kind of behavior that leads young women astray. The crowd in the store had grown larger, and Sarah could hear more voices gathering outside. The situation was spiraling beyond her control, and she felt increasingly trapped and desperate. "I have another suggestion," Morrison said, his voice taking on a false tone of magnanimity. "Since Miss McKenna refuses to acknowledge her wrongdoing, perhaps the community should decide how to handle this matter. After all, we all have to live together in this town." Sheriff Bennett nodded slowly. "What did you have in mind, Ezra?" "A public hearing," Morrison replied. "Let the townspeople hear the evidence and decide for themselves whether Miss McKenna is guilty of theft." Sarah felt her heart sinking even further. She knew that in a public hearing, Morrison's word and influence would carry far more weight than her own. As a respected businessman, he had the power to sway public opinion, while she was merely an orphaned seamstress with no family or significant social connections to speak for her. "That sounds fair," Sheriff Bennett said. "We'll hold a hearing this afternoon in the town square. Miss McKenna, you'll need to present your side of the story to the community." As Sarah nodded numbly, she caught sight of herself in the store's mirror. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear and shock. In the span of an hour, her quiet life had been turned upside down, and she faced the very real possibility of being branded a thief by the entire town. The crowd began to disperse, but Sarah could hear their whispered conversations as they left. Words like desperate, shameful, and always knew something was off about her floated back to her ears, each one feeling like a physical blow. As she stepped out into the bright morning sunlight, Sarah realized that regardless of the hearing's outcome, her life in Cedar Ridge would never be the same. The accusations had been made, the seeds of doubt planted, and in a small frontier town, reputation was everything. The morning that had started with such simple hopes, buying supplies and perhaps some fabric for a new dress, had become the beginning of what felt like the end of her world. The afternoon sun blazed mercilessly over Cedar Ridge's town square, as nearly every resident gathered for what had become the most anticipated event in months. Word of Sarah McKenna's alleged theft had spread through the small community like wildfire, and now chairs borrowed from the church and saloon were arranged in a rough semicircle around a makeshift platform constructed from wooden crates. Sarah sat on a hard wooden chair at the edge of the crowd, her hands folded tightly in her lap to stop them from trembling. She had changed into her one good dress, a deep green cotton with small white flowers that her mother had sewn for her 3 years ago. It was the finest thing she owned, and she hoped it might lend her some dignity in this moment of public scrutiny. Sheriff Bennett stood on the platform, his badge catching the sunlight as he addressed the assembled crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen of Cedar Ridge, we're here today to hear the facts surrounding the incident at Morrison's General Store this morning. This is not a formal trial, but rather a community hearing to determine the truth of the matter." The crowd murmured with anticipation. Sarah recognized faces throughout the gathering, some sympathetic, others openly hostile, and many simply curious about the drama unfolding in their typically quiet town. Mrs. Patterson from the boarding house caught Sarah's eye and offered a small, encouraging nod, which Sarah gratefully returned. "Mr. Morrison," Sheriff Bennett continued, "please present your account of this morning's events." Ezra Morrison climbed onto the platform with the confidence of a man accustomed to being heard and believed. He cut an imposing figure in his dark suit and vest, his gold watch chain gleaming across his substantial belly. As he began to speak, his voice carried easily across the square. "Good people of Cedar Ridge," he began, his tone grave and authoritative. "What happened in my store this morning was not just a crime against my business, but against the very fabric of our community. Miss McKenna entered my establishment with a purse containing $5 silver. I observed this clearly as she opened it to count her money." Sarah started to rise from her chair, but Sheriff Bennett gestured for her to remain seated. Her mouth was dry, and she felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon her. Morrison continued, his performance growing more dramatic. "She purchased goods totaling $4.50, but when it came time to pay, she attempted to shortchange me by 50 cents. When I confronted her about the missing money, she became defensive and evasive. The evidence speaks for itself. She had $5, spent $4.50, and tried to keep the remainder for herself. But she was searched," called out Tom Wheeler from the crowd. "No money was found." Morrison's expression grew stern, which only proves how cunning she was in hiding her theft. A skilled thief always has a plan for concealing their crime. Mrs. Morrison stepped forward, her shrill voice cutting through the afternoon air. "I've seen her struggling financially for months. She's been darning the same dresses over and over, buying only the cheapest cuts of meat, if any at all. Desperation drives people to do terrible things. Sarah felt heat rising in her cheeks. The humiliation of having her personal struggles laid bare before the entire town was almost more than she could bear. She had worked so hard to maintain her dignity and independence, and now even her poverty was being used as evidence against her. Furthermore, Mrs. Morrison continued, she refused to submit to a search initially. An innocent person would have nothing to hide and would welcome the opportunity to clear their name. Dr. William Hayes, the town's physician and one of its most respected citizens, raised his hand. Mrs. Morrison, while I understand your position, I think we should consider that a young woman might naturally be reluctant to undergo such a personal search, regardless of her guilt or innocence. Thank you, Dr. Hayes, Sheriff Bennett said. Miss McKenna, you may now present your side of the story. Sarah's legs felt unsteady as she made her way to the platform. The wooden crates creaked under her weight, and she gripped the edges to steady herself. Looking out at the sea of faces, she saw a mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and in some cases, genuine concern. People of Cedar Ridge, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. She cleared her throat and tried again, stronger this time. I have lived in this town for my entire life. My parents, God rest their souls, were honest, hard-working people who taught me the value of integrity above all else. She paused, drawing strength from the memory of her parents. This morning I went to Morrison's general store with exactly $4.50, money I had earned through my sewing work for Mrs. Henderson, Mrs. Clark, and several other families in town. I purchased flour, sugar, coffee beans, and inquired about fabric. The total came to $4.50, which I paid in full. Sarah's voice grew stronger as she continued. I did not steal anything. I would never steal anything. The very suggestion goes against everything I was raised to believe and everything I stand for as a person. But Mr. Morrison saw $5 in your purse, called out James Crawford from the crowd. Mr. Morrison was mistaken, Sarah replied firmly. I counted my money twice before leaving home, and I counted it again before entering the store. I had exactly what I needed to make my purchases, no more and no less. Reverend Thomas Mackenzie, the town's preacher, stood up. Miss McKenna, you've been a faithful member of our church community. I've watched you care for your ailing parents before their passing and worked tirelessly to support yourself afterward. Your character has always been above reproach. Thank you, Reverend Mackenzie, Sarah said, feeling tears prick at her eyes. I know that some of you may find it easy to believe the worst about someone in my position. I'm alone in this world with no family to defend me and limited means to support myself, but I ask you to judge me by my actions over the years, not by assumptions about what desperation might drive someone to do. Mrs. Sullivan, who ran the town's restaurant, spoke up. I've employed Sarah for extra work during busy periods. She's always been honest and reliable. I find it hard to believe she would jeopardize her reputation for 50 cents. 50 cents is a lot of money to someone in her circumstances, Morrison interjected. It might represent the difference between eating and going hungry. The crowd began to murmur among themselves, and Sarah could sense the tide of opinion shifting. Morrison's words had struck a chord with many who understood the harsh realities of frontier life. Sheriff Bennett raised his hand for silence. Are there any other witnesses to this morning's events? Several of the customers who had been in the store stepped forward. Their accounts varied slightly, but most confirmed that they had heard Morrison accuse Sarah of theft and had witnessed the search that followed. None, however, had actually seen Sarah's purse or could confirm how much money she had brought to the store. The problem, said Mayor Franklin, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles, is that we have two conflicting accounts and no definitive proof either way. Mr. Morrison, as a respected businessman, claims he saw $5. Miss McKenna, equally sincere, claims she had only $4.50. How do we resolve such a contradiction? Morrison's face took on an expression of righteous indignation. I find it insulting that my word as a pillar of this community is being questioned. I have invested my time, money, and reputation in Cedar Ridge. I have nothing to gain by making false accusations against Miss McKenna. But what does Miss McKenna have to gain by stealing 50 cents if it means risking her entire reputation? Dr. Hayes countered. The risk far outweighs any possible reward. The debate continued for another hour, with various townspeople weighing in on both sides. Sarah remained on the platform, feeling increasingly isolated as the discussion swirled around her. She watched faces in the crowd, trying to gauge who might believe her and who had already made up their minds. Finally, Mayor Franklin called for order. I believe we've heard sufficient testimony from all parties. It's time for the community to make a decision. All those who believe Miss McKenna is guilty of theft, please raise your hands." Sarah's heart hammered as she watched hands slowly rise throughout the crowd. She counted them desperately. 1, 2, 3, 15, 23, 31, more than half the assembled townspeople. "And those who believe Miss McKenna is innocent?" Fewer hands rose this time, though Sarah was grateful to see some familiar faces among them. Dr. Hayes, Reverend Mackenzie, Mrs. Patterson, Mrs. Sullivan, and about a dozen others. "The community has spoken," Mayor Franklin announced solemnly. "By a count of 31 to 16, Miss McKenna has been found guilty of theft by the citizens of Cedar Ridge." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She gripped the edge of the platform to keep from falling, her vision blurring with tears she refused to let fall in public. Morrison stepped forward, his voice carrying a tone of false sympathy. "While I'm disappointed by Miss McKenna's actions, I believe in the power of redemption. Rather than pursuing formal charges, I propose that she make public acknowledgement of her wrongdoing and accept appropriate consequences." "What kind of consequences?" Sheriff Bennett asked. "A public march through town," Morrison replied. "Let Miss McKenna walk from one end of Main Street to the other, so that all might see that theft has consequences in Cedar Ridge. It will serve as both punishment and deterrent." Sarah felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. A public march of shame was a humiliation beyond anything she had imagined. In frontier communities, such displays were typically reserved for the most serious moral failures. "That seems rather harsh," Dr. Hayes protested. "Miss McKenna is a young woman who has already endured significant hardship. Crime must have consequences," Morrison replied firmly. "If we allow theft to go unpunished, what message does that send to others who might be tempted to follow her example?" The crowd began to voice their opinions, some supporting Morrison's proposal, while others argued for leniency. Sarah listened to them debate her fate as if she were not even present, her future being decided by people who had already judged her guilty. When would this march take place? Mayor Franklin asked reluctantly. "Tomorrow morning," Morrison said. "At 10 o'clock, when the most people will be about their business. Miss McKenna will walk from the church to the saloon and back, carrying a sign acknowledging her crime." Sarah finally found her voice. "I won't do it," she said quietly. The crowd fell silent. Morrison's eyebrows rose in surprise. "I beg your pardon? I said I won't do it," Sarah repeated, her voice stronger now. "I will not publicly confess to a crime I didn't commit. I will not parade through town carrying a sign that proclaims me a thief when I am not." "Then you'll face formal charges," Sheriff Bennett said grimly, "and likely jail time." Sarah squared her shoulders, finding strength she didn't know she possessed. "Then so be it. I would rather face jail as an innocent woman than walk free as a confessed thief." The crowd erupted in surprised murmurs. Morrison's face was turning red with anger. "The girl is clearly stubborn and unrepentant. Sheriff, I demand you arrest her immediately." As Sheriff Bennett stepped toward Sarah with obvious reluctance, she closed her eyes and prepared for whatever fate awaited her. She had lost everything: her reputation, her place in the community, possibly her freedom, but she had not lost her integrity. That, at least, remained her own. The morning sun cast long shadows across Main Street as the townspeople of Cedar Ridge gathered for what had become the most anticipated spectacle in the town's recent memory. Despite Sarah McKenna's defiant refusal the previous afternoon, Sheriff Bennett had convinced her during a long night in the town's small jail that accepting the public march was preferable to facing formal charges that could result in months of imprisonment. Sarah stood in the doorway of the sheriff's office, her hands trembling as she looked out at the crowd assembled along the wooden sidewalks. Word had spread beyond Cedar Ridge overnight, and she could see faces she didn't recognize, people from neighboring settlements who had ridden in to witness the event. The spectacle had taken on a life of its own, transforming from a local matter of justice into a regional entertainment. "Are you ready, Miss McKenna?" Sheriff Bennett asked, his voice heavy with reluctance. In his hands, he held a wooden sign with leather straps, the words "thief" painted in bold black letters across its surface. Sarah's green dress, the same one she had worn to the hearing, was wrinkled from her night in the jail cell. Her auburn hair, usually so carefully arranged, hung loose around her shoulders. She had spent the sleepless night alternating between anger and despair, but now, facing the reality of her situation, she felt strangely calm. "I suppose I have no choice," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "You can still change your mind," Sheriff Bennett said quietly. "We could send word to the territorial judge, have a proper trial. And spend months in jail, waiting for justice that might never come? Sarah shook her head. No, Sheriff, let's get this over with. The crowd parted as Sarah stepped onto the street, the wooden sign hanging around her neck like a millstone. She could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her, and the murmur of voices created a constant buzz in her ears. Some faces showed sympathy, others satisfaction, and many simply curiosity about the unfolding drama. Ezra Morrison stood prominently near his store, his arms crossed over his chest, and a look of grim satisfaction on his face. Beside him, his wife Constance whispered to a group of women, no doubt providing commentary on Sarah's appearance and demeanor. "This is what happens when people forget their place," Mrs. Morrison said loudly enough for Sarah to hear. "Pride comes before a fall, and this girl's pride has been her downfall." Sarah forced herself to keep walking, her eyes fixed on the church steeple at the far end of Main Street. Each step felt like an eternity, and she could hear fragments of conversation from the onlookers. Such a shame. Always seemed like a nice girl. My husband says she's been struggling since her parents died. Still no excuse for stealing. 50 cents ain't worth ruining your life over. As Sarah reached the halfway point of her journey, she noticed a commotion at the edge of town. A lone rider was approaching, silhouetted against the morning sun. The figure sat tall in the saddle, and even from a distance there was something commanding about his presence. The rider drew closer, and Sarah could see he was a man of perhaps 30 years, wearing the practical clothing of someone who spent his life on the trail. His dark hair was slightly longer than was fashionable in town, and his weathered face spoke of years under the open sky. He rode a sturdy chestnut horse, with the easy confidence of someone born to the saddle. The crowd's attention began to shift from Sarah to this unexpected arrival. Strangers were common enough in Cedar Ridge. The town sat along a well-traveled route between larger settlements, but there was something about this man's timing and manner that drew curious stares. The rider's eyes swept over the scene, taking in the gathered crowd, the woman walking with a sign around her neck, and the general atmosphere of public spectacle. His expression remained neutral, but Sarah caught something in his gaze, a flicker of disapproval perhaps, or simple curiosity about what he had stumbled upon. "Who's that?" someone in the crowd asked. "I never seen him before," came the reply. "Looks like a drifter." The stranger guided his horse closer to the crowd, and Sarah could see his face more clearly now. He had strong features, a straight nose, defined jawline, and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. There was a quality about him that suggested he was accustomed to command, though he wore no badge or uniform. "Excuse me," the stranger said, his voice carrying clearly across the street. "What's happening here?" Sheriff Bennett stepped forward. "Nothing that concerns you, stranger. Town business." "I can see that," the man replied, dismounting from his horse with fluid grace. "I'm just curious about the nature of this your business." Morrison, never one to miss an opportunity to justify his actions, spoke up. "This woman is a thief. She stole from my store, and now she's receiving appropriate punishment for her crime." The stranger's gaze shifted to Sarah, and she felt something pass between them. Not recognition, for they had never met, but a moment of human connection that transcended their circumstances. His eyes were kind but sharp, and she sensed he was evaluating not just her appearance but the entire situation. "What did she steal?" the stranger asked. 50 cents, Morrison replied proudly. "She tried to shortchange me at my general store." The stranger's eyebrows rose slightly. 50 cents, and for this you're parading her through town like a common criminal? "Theft is theft regardless of the amount," Morrison said defensively. "The law is the law." "I see." The stranger's voice remained calm, but Sarah detected an edge to it. "And she confessed to this theft?" "She was found guilty by the citizens of this town," Sheriff Bennett interjected. "We held a proper hearing yesterday." "Found guilty," the stranger repeated. "But did she confess?" Sarah found her voice. "No, sir, I did not confess because I am not guilty." The crowd began to murmur again, some annoyed by this interruption to their entertainment, others curious about where this conversation might lead. The stranger studied Sarah's face intently. "You maintain your innocence?" "I do," Sarah replied, standing straighter despite the weight of the sign around her neck. "I have never stolen anything in my life." "Then why are you here?" "Because I was given a choice between this public humiliation and spending months in jail awaiting a trial that might never come," Sarah answered honestly. "I chose what seemed like the lesser of two evils." The stranger nodded slowly, as if this explanation made perfect sense to him. He turned back to Morrison. "Who you own the general store?" "I do. Morrison's General Store, finest establishment in Cedar Ridge." "And you're certain this woman stole from you?" "Absolutely certain," Morrison replied, his chest puffing with self-importance. "I saw $5 in her purse. She bought $4.50 worth of goods and tried to leave without paying the full amount." "Interesting," the stranger said. "And where is this 50 cents now?" Morrison's face showed the first sign of uncertainty. "Well, she must have hidden it somewhere. When we searched her, we didn't find it, but you're certain she took it?" "I know what I saw," Morrison said firmly. The stranger walked closer to Sarah, and she could smell the scent of leather and horse and something else. Perhaps sage from the prairie. When he spoke, his voice was gentle but carried to the crowd. "Miss, what's your name?" "Sarah McKenna," she replied. "Miss McKenna, I'm Thomas Brennan, but most folks call me Tom. I'm a stranger here, so I don't know you or your character. But I've traveled through many towns, and I've seen many kinds of justice. Sometimes what people call justice is just fear and prejudice dressed up in fancy clothes." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. It had been so long since anyone had spoken to her with simple human kindness that she had almost forgotten what it felt like. Tom turned to address the crowd. "Folks, I know this isn't my business and I'm just passing through your town, but I've got to ask, does this seem right to you? Parading a young woman through the streets over 50 cents that nobody can prove she took?" "Now see here," Morrison sputtered. "Who are you to question our justice?" "I'm nobody special," Tom replied. "Just a man who believes in fairness. And this doesn't look fair to me." Dr. Hayes stepped forward from the crowd. "Mr. Brennan, is it? I appreciate your concern, but this matter has been decided by the community. Miss McKenna was found guilty by a majority vote of her neighbors." "Doctor, I respect that," Tom said. "But let me ask you something. If you were falsely accused of a crime, would you want your fate decided by a popularity contest, or would you want someone to actually prove you did what they say you did?" The crowd was growing restless. Some were clearly annoyed by this interruption to their entertainment, while others seemed to be reconsidering the situation in light of Tom's questions. "The girl is getting what she deserves," called out James Crawford. "She's been putting on airs, acting like she's better than her station. This will teach her some humility." Tom's expression hardened. "So this is about putting someone in their place, not about justice?" "Of course it's about justice," Sheriff Bennett said, but his tone lacked conviction. Tom walked back to his horse and reached into his saddlebags. When he turned around, Sarah saw he was holding a small leather pouch that clinked with the sound of coins. "Mr. Morrison," Tom said, his voice carrying clearly across the street. "You say Miss McKenna owes you 50 cents? "That's right," Morrison replied suspiciously. Tom opened the pouch and counted out 50 cents in silver coins. "Here's 50 cents, consider the debt paid." The crowd fell silent. Morrison's face was turning red. "That's not the point. She stole from me, and she needs to face the consequences." "But if the debt is paid, what consequences?" Tom asked reasonably. "You have your money, she has her goods, everyone's square." "It doesn't work that way," Morrison protested. "She committed a crime." "Did she?" Tom's voice was quiet but penetrating. "Because from where I stand, I see a lot of accusation but precious little proof, and I see a whole town willing to destroy a young woman's reputation over 50 cents that nobody can prove she took." Tom walked over to Sarah and, without saying a word, lifted the wooden sign from around her neck. The crowd gasped at his audacity. "Miss McKenna," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "you don't belong here, come with me." Sarah stared at him in shock. I can't. The sheriff can arrest me if he wants," Tom said calmly, "but he's not going to let this continue." He held out his hand to her, and Sarah saw something in his eyes that she hadn't seen directed at her in a very long time. Respect. Without fully understanding why, Sarah reached out and took his hand. The moment Sarah's hand touched Tom's, a ripple of shock ran through the assembled crowd. Murmurs of disbelief and outrage erupted from the onlookers as the stranger, who had ridden into their town just minutes before now, stood defiantly between them and their spectacle. "Now hold on there, mister," Sheriff Bennett said, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun belt. "You can't just interfere with our justice." Tom's grip on Sarah's hand was firm but gentle, and he positioned himself protectively in front of her. "Justice?" he repeated, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. "Is that what you call this circus? That man has no right." Ezra Morrison shouted, pushing forward through the crowd. "Miss McKenna is a convicted thief, and she must complete her punishment." Tom's eyes never left the sheriff's face. "Sheriff Bennett, isn't it? I'm curious about something. What evidence do you have that Miss McKenna actually stole anything?" Sheriff Bennett shifted uncomfortably under Tom's steady gaze. "Well, mister, Morrison is a respected member of this community. His word His word against hers, Tom interrupted. But where's the evidence? Where's the missing money? Where's the proof that any crime was actually committed? Dr. Hayes stepped closer, his medical bag in hand. Mr. Brennan, while I appreciate your concern for Miss McKenna, you must understand that this matter was decided by the community, after careful consideration. Careful consideration? Tom's voice rose slightly. Doctor, I've been listening to your townspeople talk, and what I hear is a lot of assumption and prejudice dressed up as fact. This young woman is being punished because she's poor and alone, not because anyone can prove she did anything wrong. Mrs. Morrison's shrill voice cut through the crowd. How dare you come into our town and question our judgment? We know Sarah McKenna, and we know she's been desperate for money. Desperation leads to theft. Tom turned his attention to Mrs. Morrison, and Sarah could see the controlled anger in his posture. Ma'am, being poor isn't a crime, and even if it were, it wouldn't justify this public humiliation. She refused to confess, Morrison called out. An innocent person would have confessed to clear their name. An innocent person would refuse to confess to something they didn't do, Tom replied sharply. That's exactly what an innocent person would do. Sarah found her voice, strengthened by Tom's unwavering support. Mr. Morrison, you know as well as I do that I had exactly $4.50 when I entered your store. I counted it twice before leaving home. You're a liar as well as a thief, Morrison shot back. The words had barely left Morrison's mouth when Tom stepped forward, his movement quick and fluid. The crowd collectively held its breath as the two men faced each other, Tom's height and broader shoulders making Morrison appear smaller and less imposing. Mr. Morrison, Tom said, his voice deadly quiet, I'd be very careful about calling Miss McKenna a liar. A man's reputation can be destroyed just as easily as a woman's, and I have a feeling yours might not survive close examination. Morrison's face paled slightly. Are you threatening me? I'm suggesting that before you destroy someone else's character, you might want to make sure your own is spotless, Tom replied. Now I've paid the 50 cents you claim she owes you. The debt is settled. The debt may be settled, but the crime remains, Sheriff Bennett said, though his voice lacked conviction. Miss McKenna was found guilty by her peers. Tom looked around at the assembled crowd, his gaze taking in each face. Her peers? Let me ask you something, Sheriff. How many of these people actually witnessed the alleged theft? How many saw Miss McKenna take money from Mr. Morrison's till or hide stolen coins? The crowd began to shift uncomfortably. Sarah realized that Tom was systematically dismantling the case against her, pointing out the obvious flaws that everyone had been too caught up in the drama to notice. Nobody witnessed the actual theft, Sheriff Bennett admitted reluctantly. Then on what basis was she convicted? Tom pressed. On Mr. Morrison's word alone? Mr. Morrison is a pillar of the community, Mayor Franklin interjected, stepping forward with his thin frame rigid with authority. His reputation is above reproach. Is it? Tom asked, and something in his tone made Morrison stiffen. Tell me, Mr. Morrison, how exactly did your general store become so prosperous so quickly? You've only been in Cedar Ridge for 5 years, yet you seem to have accumulated considerable wealth. I'm a good businessman, Morrison replied defensively. I work hard and provide quality goods at fair prices. Fair prices, Tom repeated thoughtfully. Interesting phrase. Miss McKenna, what do you typically pay for flour at Morrison's store? Sarah hesitated, unsure where Tom was leading but trusting his instincts. 25 cents for a 5-pound bag. Tom nodded. And what did you pay for the same flour in other towns before Mr. Morrison arrived? 15 to 18 cents, Sarah replied, beginning to understand. Tom turned to address the crowd. Folks, I've been through a lot of frontier towns, and I know what things cost. Mr. Morrison's prices are significantly higher than what you'd pay in most places. He's been taking advantage of your isolation and lack of competition. The crowd began to murmur, and Sarah could see doubt creeping into many faces. Morrison's prosperity suddenly seemed less admirable and more suspicious. That's good business, Morrison stammered. Supply and demand. It's exploitation, Tom said firmly. And it makes me wonder what else you might be willing to do for an extra 50 cents. The implication hung heavy in the air. Sheriff Bennett cleared his throat. Mr. Brennan, are you suggesting that Mr. Morrison falsely accused Miss McKenna? I'm suggesting that a man who would overcharge his neighbors for basic necessities might not be above falsely accusing a vulnerable young woman to protect his reputation and his profits, Tom replied. Mrs. Patterson stepped forward from the crowd, her usual quiet demeanor replaced by visible anger. Ezra Morrison, I've been thinking about this all night. Sarah McKenna helped me when my husband was dying. sitting up with him for days without asking for payment. She's one of the most honest people I know, and I've never known her to lie about anything," added Mrs. Sullivan. "She's worked in my restaurant, and I've trusted her with my cash drawer multiple times. Nothing has ever gone missing." Dr. Hayes nodded slowly. "I've treated Miss McKenna and her family for years. Her parents were honest, hard-working people, and they raised their daughter to be the same way." Tom could see the tide of opinion beginning to turn. "Sheriff Bennett, it seems to me that you've got one man's word against not only Miss McKenna's denial, but also the testimony of multiple community members about her character." Morrison was growing desperate. "This is ridiculous. I saw what I saw. She had $5 and only paid $4.50. "Did you?" Tom asked quietly. "Or did you see an opportunity to get rid of someone who might have been asking inconvenient questions about your business practices?" "I don't know what you're talking about," Morrison replied, but sweat was beading on his forehead despite the morning chill. Tom reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small notebook. "Mr. Morrison, I'm curious about something. How do you keep track of your inventory and sales?" I have a ledger, of course. Every good businessman keeps records." "Of course," Tom agreed. "And I'm sure you'd have no problem showing those records to Sheriff Bennett. After all, if Miss McKenna stole 50 cents from you, it should show up as a discrepancy in your books." Morrison's face went ashen. "My ledger is private business information, not if it proves a crime was committed," Sheriff Bennett said, suddenly looking more interested. "Ezra, if your books show that 50 cents went missing, that would be important evidence." The books are at home," Morrison said weakly. "Then let's go get them," Tom suggested pleasantly. "I'm sure everyone here would be interested in seeing proof of this theft." The crowd was now openly murmuring, and Sarah could see that many people were beginning to look at Morrison with suspicion rather than respect. His refusal to produce evidence was damning in its obviousness. Reverend Mackenzie stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of his position. "Ezra, I've been quiet through this whole affair because I believed in giving you the benefit of the doubt. But Mr. Brennan raises valid questions. If you have proof of theft, why haven't you presented it?" Morrison looked around desperately, realizing that his support was crumbling. "I don't need to prove anything. This girl is nothing but trouble, and everyone knows it." "Actually," Tom said calmly, "it seems like everyone knows quite the opposite. Miss McKenna appears to be well regarded by the people who actually know her character." Sheriff Bennett was looking increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. "Ezra, I think we need to take a step back here. Maybe we moved too fast on this." "Too fast?" Morrison exploded. "She's a thief!" "Just because this stranger rides into town and starts asking questions doesn't change the facts." "What facts?" Tom asked pointedly. "You've presented accusations, assumptions, and prejudices, but I haven't heard a single fact that proves Miss McKenna stole anything from you." Sarah felt a surge of gratitude toward this mysterious stranger who had appeared from nowhere to defend her. She still didn't understand his motives or even who he really was, but his intervention had given her hope for the first time since this nightmare began. "Sheriff Bennett," Tom continued, "I think you should investigate Mr. Morrison's business practices. I suspect you'll find that Miss McKenna isn't the only person he's taken advantage of." "This is preposterous," Morrison shouted. "I'm the victim here." "No," Tom said firmly, his arm moving protectively around Sarah's shoulders. "Miss McKenna is the victim. She's been accused without evidence, convicted without proof, and humiliated for the entertainment of people who should have protected her." The crowd was now clearly divided, with many faces showing shame and regret. The spectacle they had come to enjoy was revealing uncomfortable truths about their own community and their willingness to condemn one of their own. "Miss McKenna," Tom said gently, "you don't owe these people anything. You've done nothing wrong, and you don't need to prove your innocence to them." Sarah felt tears of relief streaming down her face. For the first time in 2 days, someone believed her completely and unconditionally. "Thank you," she whispered. Tom squeezed her hand gently. "You're welcome. Now, let's get you away from here." As they began to walk toward Tom's horse, Sheriff Bennett called out, "Wait, where are you taking her?" Tom paused and looked back. "Somewhere she'll be treated with the respect she deserves. Unless you're planning to arrest her for crimes you can't prove she committed." Sheriff Bennett said nothing, and Tom helped Sarah mount his horse before swinging up behind her. As they rode away from the crowd, Sarah could hear the angry voices behind them, but for the first time in days she felt safe. The rhythmic sound of hoofbeats on packed earth gradually replaced the angry voices of Cedar Ridge as Tom guided his horse along a well-worn trail leading away from town. Sarah sat in front of him in the saddle, acutely aware of his strong arms on either side of her as he held the reins. She had never been this close to a man before, and under different circumstances, she might have been overwhelmed by the propriety of the situation. But after the ordeal she had just endured, she felt only profound gratitude for his unexpected intervention. "Where are we going?" Sarah asked softly, her voice barely audible over the horse's steady gait. "There's a ranch about 5 miles north of town," Tom replied, his voice calm and reassuring. "Belongs to a friend of mine. We'll be safe there while we figure out what to do next." Sarah turned slightly in the saddle to look at him. "Why did you help me? You don't even know me." Tom's dark eyes met hers, and she saw a depth of understanding that surprised her. "Sometimes you don't need to know someone's whole story to recognize when they're being treated unjustly. What happened back there wasn't right, and I couldn't just ride by and let it continue." They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the morning sun warming their faces as they traveled through the rolling prairie landscape. Sarah found herself relaxing for the first time in days, the tension slowly leaving her shoulders as Cedar Ridge disappeared behind them. The ranch that came into view was modest but well-maintained, with a sturdy log house, a barn, and several outbuildings scattered across a small valley. Cattle grazed peacefully in fenced pastures, and Sarah could see horses in a corral near the barn. Smoke rose from the house's chimney, indicating that someone was home. As they approached the house, a woman emerged onto the front porch. She was perhaps 40 years old, with graying brown hair pulled back in a practical bun and wearing a simple blue dress covered by a well-worn apron. Her face was kind but weathered by years of frontier life. "Tom Brennan," she called out with obvious pleasure. "What brings you by so early in the morning?" Tom dismounted and helped Sarah down from the horse. "Hello, Martha. I'm afraid I've got myself involved in some trouble in town, and I was hoping you might be able to help a lady in distress." Martha's eyes took in Sarah's disheveled appearance and the obvious signs of recent distress on her face. Without hesitation, she stepped forward with outstretched arms. "Of course, dear," she said warmly to Sarah. "Any friend of Tom's is welcome here. I'm Martha Henderson, and my husband Jake and I own this ranch." "Sarah McKenna," Sarah replied, accepting Martha's embrace gratefully. "I'm very pleased to meet you, though I wish it were under better circumstances." "Come inside, both of you," Martha said, ushering them toward the house. "I've got coffee on the stove and fresh biscuits just out of the oven. You can tell me what's happened while you eat." The interior of the Henderson house was warm and welcoming, with handmade furniture and colorful quilts that spoke of a woman's loving touch. Martha bustled about, setting places at a large wooden table and filling cups with steaming coffee. "Jake's out checking on the cattle," Martha explained as she served them. "He'll be back for lunch. Now, Tom, what's this about trouble in town?" Over breakfast, Tom recounted the events in Cedar Ridge, his voice growing increasingly angry as he described Morrison's accusations and the town's willingness to condemn Sarah without evidence. Martha listened with growing indignation, occasionally making sympathetic sounds and reaching over to pat Sarah's hand reassuringly. "That's absolutely disgraceful," Martha said when Tom finished. "Ezra Morrison has always struck me as a slippery character. Jake and I drive to Laramie for most of our supplies because we don't trust Morrison's prices or his business practices." Sarah looked up from her untouched biscuit. "You know Mr. Morrison?" "Unfortunately, yes," Martha replied. "He tried to cheat Jake on a horse sale about 2 years ago. Claimed the animal was worth twice what any reasonable person would pay. When Jake refused, Morrison spread rumors about the quality of our cattle. We lost some business because of his lies." Tom leaned forward with interest. "Has Morrison caused problems for other people?" "Oh yes," Martha said, warming to the subject. "There's the widow Peterson. He convinced her to sell her late husband's tools for a fraction of their worth, then turned around and sold them for a huge profit. And young Billy Cartwright worked for Morrison for 3 months last year and never received his full wages. Morrison always had some excuse about damaged goods or unsatisfactory work." Sarah felt a growing sense of vindication. "So I'm not the first person he's tried to cheat." "Not by a long shot, dear," Martha confirmed. "The problem is that Morrison has money and influence in Cedar Ridge. People are afraid to cross him because they depend on his store." Tom stood and walked to the window, looking out across the peaceful ranch landscape. "There has to be a way to expose him for what he really is." "Maybe there is," Martha said thoughtfully. "Tom, you mentioned that Morrison refused to show his ledger as proof of the theft." "That's right. He claimed it was private business information." Martha smiled grimly. "I happen to know that Morrison keeps his ledger in the store during business hours. He's very proud of his bookkeeping and often shows it to customers to demonstrate how successful his business is." "So if someone were to examine that ledger," Tom began. They might find discrepancies that would prove Morrison has been cheating people all along, Martha finished. The question is how to get access to it. Sarah had been listening to this conversation with growing hope, but now she felt compelled to speak up. I can't ask either of you to take risks for me. You've already done so much. Tom turned from the window, his expression serious. Sarah, this isn't just about you anymore. Morrison has been taking advantage of people for years. If we can expose him, we'll be helping the entire community. But how? Sarah asked. He's not going to voluntarily hand over his books for examination. Martha stood and began clearing the breakfast dishes, her movements efficient and purposeful. Jake has a friend who works for the territorial government, a man named Robert Dalton, who investigates fraudulent business practices. If we could get word to him about Morrison's activities, he might be able to force an official examination of the books. How long would that take? Tom asked. Weeks, possibly months, Martha admitted, but there might be a faster way. She paused in her work, a thoughtful expression on her face. Morrison's store is closed on Sundays for church services. If someone were to accidentally leave a window unlocked, a concerned citizen might be able to examine those books themselves. Tom and Sarah exchanged glances. Martha, are you suggesting we break into Morrison's store? I'm suggesting that sometimes justice requires a little creative interpretation of the law, Martha replied with a slight smile, especially when the law has failed to protect the innocent. Before anyone could respond, they heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Martha looked out the window and smiled. That's Jake coming back for lunch. Perfect timing. Jake Henderson proved to be a tall, lean man with sun-weathered skin and kind eyes that reminded Sarah of her late father. After Martha explained the situation, his face darkened with anger. I've been telling folks in Cedar Ridge for years that Morrison was trouble, he said, settling into a chair at the table, but nobody wanted to listen because his store was convenient. Jake, what do you know about Morrison's background? Tom asked. Where did he come from before Cedar Ridge? Jake scratched his graying beard thoughtfully. Now that you mention it, he was always vague about his past. Said he came from Kansas, but he never talked about family or previous business ventures. Most folks who come west have stories to tell, but Morrison always changed the subject when anyone asked about his life before Cedar Ridge. That's interesting, Tom mused. A man with something to hide often creates a new identity when he moves to a new place. Sarah felt a spark of an idea forming. Mr. Henderson, you said you have a friend in the territorial government. Does he have access to records about business licenses and criminal backgrounds? He might, Jake replied. Why do you ask? If Morrison is using a false name or has a criminal past, that would certainly explain his reluctance to face scrutiny, Sarah said, and it might give us leverage to force him to admit the truth about what happened in his store. Tom looked at Sarah with new respect. That's brilliant thinking. Jake, how quickly could you get word to your friend? I could ride to Laramie this afternoon and send a telegram, Jake replied, but it might take several days to get a response. Martha had been listening thoughtfully. In the meantime, we need to think about Sarah's immediate situation. She can't go back to Cedar Ridge, not after what happened this morning. You're welcome to stay here as long as you need, Jake said immediately. We've got a spare room, and Martha could use some help with the household work. Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes once again. The kindness of these strangers was overwhelming after the hostility she had faced in town. I don't know how to thank you. You don't need to thank us, Martha said firmly. We're just doing what's right. Tom stood and walked to the window again, his expression troubled. There's something else we need to consider. Morrison isn't going to take this morning's events quietly. He's probably already organizing the townspeople to come looking for Sarah. As if summoned by his words, they could hear the distant sound of multiple horses approaching the ranch. Jake moved quickly to the window and peered out. Riders coming, he announced grimly. Looks like about 6 or 7 men. Sarah's heart sank. Just when she had begun to feel safe, the nightmare was starting all over again. Tom checked his pistol and moved toward the door. Jake, do you have weapons? You have. Rifle and shotgun, Jake replied, already moving toward a gun cabinet in the corner of the room. Martha put a protective arm around Sarah. Don't worry, dear. These men aren't going to take you anywhere you don't want to go. As the sound of hoofbeats grew closer, Sarah realized that her ordeal was far from over, but for the first time since this began, she wasn't facing it alone.